We come to the 11th presentation in this year-long series, and its title is Parayana. Para meaning very, very high and beyond. Yana meaning way. It's the way beyond, it's the high way. And the subtitle of Parayana here for the whole year is Entering Our High Dharma Way. And it takes a little refinement in our hearing to appreciate that there is a major dimensional shift between Dharma and high Dharma. The Sanskrit word Dharma means truth, and there's a dimensional shift between truth and high truth. In 1987, here in Los Angeles at the Philosophical Research Society, I delivered a 12 presentation series with a 4 presentation augmentation, making it 16, so that it was a 16-part or 16 aspect presentation of the high Dharma. The lectures and courses up till 1992 are page by page, presentation by presentation put into this little book. That was 22 years ago. I had already done all this kind of work. For 1987, for instance, there were 4 series of presentations. The first was the Hermetic tradition, from the Renaissance to the founding of the United States. And for that series, I wrote a book. It's about 300 pages, very academic, on the roots of Hermetic America, Hermetic Renaissance, the roots of Hermetic America. The second series in 1987 was the natural follow-up to that, was Hermetic America Matrix. And this was a series of 22 presentations, and it was called the Synthesizing Vector, Hermetic America Matrix, a matrix that will have a vector, will be able to have an undertone and an overtone to that vector, and one will be able to have in that dynamic eventually the development of a mathematics of a tensor, and is on the level of high Dharma tensor expressiveness that Einstein was able to deliver his theory of relativity, that the whole beginnings of quantum mechanics were based, so that Newton was a Dharma and Einstein and Niels Bohr, etc., were a high Dharma. The difference in psychology, if one looks at Dharma, one of the outstanding aspects of Dharma in psychology is types. Types. One of Bertrand Russell's most famous books that was a prelude to his great 3-volume Principia Mathematica, published by Cambridge University Press. The prelude to it was the theory of types. While types are Dharma, an aspect of Dharma, the archetypes are high Dharma. So that when one looks at Russell with his theory of types, one comes to understand the principles, principia, of mathematics, mathematici in the higher Dharma of Pythagorean. For Pythagoreans, those who could hear were able to hear the truth. They were called the hearers, the akousmatiki in Greek. But those who could see, not see with the eyes focused in an integral way, but with the inner eye, sometimes called the third eye, but the all-seeing eye, one was able then to see not only the shapes and forms in their resonances and the resonances in their harmonic, but also to see the dynamic that was the go-between, and this dynamic energy was very often a time signature. So that the development from Newton's Dharma, Newton and Leibniz at the very same time, Newton had the Dharma of calculus, the infinitesimal calculus and the differential calculus, the integral and the differential. And time, those equations and so forth, was truly magnificent and is the reference wave for our carrier wave that came beginning to reach its apex about 1991 of a whole new time form. So that time is extremely important all the time, as it were, and gives us an index by the way in which the spatiality of the universe may be investigated in terms of its primordial dynamics. There is such a thing as heat, there is such a thing as thermodynamics. The science of thermodynamics is not only mathematical, but is engineering as well. And so the high Dharma enables us to look at the fundamental truths that have come to be understood in terms of the mind, in terms of the whole integral cycle of nature, of the world, of the universe. But those dimensions beyond, and the first dimension beyond that is the fifth dimension of consciousness, of a whole different field. That the field of the integral is nature, but the field of vision is consciousness. The difference being that nature's field, before there is a space signature of dimensions, there's a time dimension. It's instantaneously space, but nevertheless time is the trigger that pulls the blossoming of dimensions of space. And though it happens instantly, it would not happen at all if there were not time already dynamic before it. So that time is the energy, and space is the blossoming of matter, so that space itself becomes, understandably, a vast matter that is indexed by time all the time, but that time itself has emerged spontaneously out of something that only can be called a zero dimension initially, so that one says nature is a zero field, but vision, differential consciousness, is an infinite field. So in 1987, in doing a series of 16 presentations, and the reason for 16 is that in the classical Buddha, in his analysis of thought, he found that there was a particle of thought. And in Sanskrit, particality in thought is called the citta, C-I-T-T-A or C-H-I-T-T-A. But for the Buddha, realizing that there was a citta original, he called it the bodhicitta, the enlightenment part, the God particle, if you want to use Letterman's description of searching for the Higgs boson. We're looking for a God particle, where mass comes from, where energy comes from, so that we can understand why it is that the universe is so sophisticated in terms of our mental understanding, in terms of the truth of our symbolic mind, yet there is more to it that is mysterious than what is understood existentially. The high Dharma opens up the spontaneous emergence out of a zero field of a dimension, oneness of time as an energy signature that instantly blossoms space, so that space-time is the correct usage of language when you're in the universe. Then you can call it space-time. But when you're in the high Dharma, it's best to call it not just time-space, but conscious time-space. So that the infinity of consciousness fertilizes the zero field of nature, so that what originally occurs then is the spontaneous emergence of time and the instantaneous blossoming of space and matter. Time there is an energy, and space is a matter. Dark matter actually is space, and dark energy actually is time, and they emerge, bang, bang, out of an infinite field of differential and kaleidoscopic consciousness. The difference being, like types being the Dharma, and archetypes being the high Dharma, there is a realization, not just a distinction, but a realization that there is a universe, truthfully, but there is a cosmos, very truthfully, high Dharma and Dharma. There is a type and an archetype, and that one then can have a mentality to understand a theory of types, with the proviso that one understands that theory in Greek comes from theoria, and it doesn't mean theorizing, it means contemplating. Theoria is contemplation, and there is such a thing as the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life, because life has a high Dharma dimensionality to it. Life precedes the energy of time, and definitely precedes the matter of space and particality, so that when one looks at a high Dharma, the realization is that life is before primordiality. In 1987, with the High Dharma series, it was a part of the 1987 year's season of giving presentations. And as I said, that 1987 year began with the Hermetic tradition from the Renaissance to the founding of the United States. And my book was on the roots of Hermetic America. which will be published probably next year. Then came Hermetic America Matrix. Then came the alchemical core of Carl Jung's work. And finally, the fourth season of 1987 was the High Dharma, being this particular course. And that was now 27 years ago. So I've been doing this for a long time. My first course on the Hermetic Renaissance was in San Francisco, at San Francisco State in 1966. So what I am gifting, not just telling, not just teaching, not just giving, gifting, is not just a comprehension, but an encompassing. Carl Jaspers, in his great book on the understanding of history, said that the encompassing, the Ungriffigkeit, is the mode by which one comes to appreciate aesthetically and analytically that history is of enormous dimensional complexity, and that in fact, as vision has its differential consciousness, history has its kaleidoscopic consciousness. And so it is the dimension of history related to the dimension of vision, the fifth dimension of vision, and the seventh dimension of history are interfaced by a sixth dimension. And that sixth dimension is art. And the threshold of art is the artist. And the artist emerges spontaneously from vision to produce the works of art. And the first work of art that is produced is the genesis, the emerging of the artist. So the prismatic person of the artist, emerging from the infinite field of differential conscious vision, is that interface that when the creative imagining and remembering, both gerunds, creative imagining, remembering, come together in a ratio of the real, as I have long termed it. That is how art is made. And the artists, having made themselves that way, are able to do a very classic do-si-do, and not only have creative imagining as the numerator and remembering as the denominator of that ratioing, of that proportion, but they are able to also express by their doing, by their living, by their artworks, fitting in then to a personal development, a personal history. And the artist fits into the development of the general history that emerges in a high dharma way. And so the ratio becomes do-si-do, the numerator becomes remembering, and the denominator becomes creative imagining. So that there is an artist who emerges spontaneously out of vision and then re-emerges spontaneously out of history. And in this, life is the sinuous, largely invisible until one begins to acclimate oneself to seeing, with quotation marks, to vision, to be visioning the art as the aesthetic jewel that is able then to show the prismatic person how to shine, how to be radiant. And it is the works of art that help us to reach through the visionary field back into the symbolic mind and to show the symbols that they have multiple meanings, multiple possibilities of meaning, and that the denominator for the truth, for the Dharma of all symbols is the beginning of that integral cycle, and the beginning goes back to the zero field of nature. So that one has to use a very deep, high Dharma wisdom to be able to understand that the zeros count. They don't count like on the fingers, but they count as the spaces between the fingers. And the spaces between the fingers are not those spaces. They can't be counted because it is the same space. So that nature, as a zero field, is omnipresent in the way in which particularity in energy and in matter, in particles and in waves, occur in tandem, not only as binaries, but as a pair, so that the tuning by pairs is a universal way of calibrating. But the tuning by pairs of pairs is the universal way of recalibrating. So that one has, in the theory of types, in a Dharma, one has in the integral cycle, the mind is able to frame. But in the high Dharma, the differential conscious prismatic person capable of jewel-like kaleidoscopic consciousness of history is able to show that it isn't just a frame, but is a pair of pairs, and that this makes a square of attention, and that the mind in its integral is only able to be clear, to be precise, when it uses a frame, and the realization that that framing is an attentive conditioning. As soon as you put a frame, it has been conditioned. And even though you can move it very fast and expand it or shrink it very much, it's still framing. But when it is doubly transformed, it becomes a square of attention initially. That's when the high Dharma first comes into play, that you understand that your frame of reference is in actuality a square of attention. That's a transform from the frame to the square of attention, and that the square of attention has the ability to be further transformed by a magnetic chirality. It can go right-handed or left-handed. And that square of attention, when it is rotated 90 degrees one way to the right, or one way 90 degrees to the left, and that square in that chirality becomes a diamond. And that diamond jewel is the transform of the square of attention to the diamond of realization. So that the high Dharma is a pair of dimensions beyond the dimensions of truth, and is capable to be transformed again by two more dimensions to the very high Dharma. Then you have what Pythagoras first called a cosmos. The cosmos is real in those 4 Dharma dimensions and those 4 high Dharma dimensions that come together and make an 8. And that 8 reveals a 9th, which is the fact that one can work with the complementarity. And when one works with that quantum dynamic complementarity, one begins to have a resonance of a 3rd kind of field. There was the field of nature, a 0 field. There was the field of consciousness, an infinite field. Now a 3rd field comes into play. And that 3rd field in advanced physics, astrophysics, 21st century parlance, it's called hyperspace. Hyperspace. Not a superspace, a hyperspace. A superspace is in the misapprehension of vision as being supernatural. The hyperspace has a 10-dimensional 3rd field quality and is able to have an acceptance of the field of nature, the field of consciousness, and the field of the real, which has still the veracity, even in a high Dharma, of having a tunable pair. And so the 10-dimensional hyperspace has a pair of an 11th dimension, which is not a thing other than the fertility of life. And so the 0 field of nature, Mother Nature, becomes pregnant because of the fertility of an 11th dimension of conscious space, time, raised to a 3rd level actuality. And so that not only is birth existential and real, but that birth occurred because of love. And this is how love not becomes or energizes, but that love in life discloses the real. And this is extremely interesting because very quickly, if you have not learned to learn, you will slip instantly, faster than the mind can detect. You think magicians with their legerdemain are fast. This is really fast. In fact, it's faster than the instantaneousness of time, so that one has to be capable of dimensions of kaleidoscopic complementarity and differentiality to be able to not be, but do. Yoda tells young Master Luke, do not think, do. Written because of Joseph Campbell informing Kasdan and Lucas and those writers of the Star Wars that this seems to be the secret of secrets, which is easy to mistake as pragmatic. The Greek word pragmatos means action. Or not just pragmatic, but karmic. Karma means that actions have their reverberations, the causality. But the karma is causal only in the universe. Only in the integral dimensions of the universe is there karma. In the high Dharma, there is no karma. There is the gifting, and it is this punyas, that the gifting, the English translation of that Sanskrit word is merit, bestows merit not as something, but bestows the invisible light of the way in which freedom from karma is real, is hyper real. And it is this way of teaching, it is this way of high wisdom, refinement, and then being refined, that came to a focus like an arrow of exactitude about 1900 years ago, in the way in which the original Hermetica were written in Alexandria in the 90s AD. And without understanding how that came to be and what that means, and then what that meaning means, we are not able to even imagine, because the imagination already is still in the integral. The capacity for imagination, for imaging, comes out of the doing, but the doing is in a kind of a ritual comportment. The existentiality of things and of actions, the ritual base, generates the images. And then those images, whether they're of feeling or of sight or of sound, when they're indexed by language, when they're indexed by an oral language, the sound of an oral language is able to engender the fruitfulness of the images of what one sees, one hears, one tastes, one feels, all of the senses, including awareness. All of that comes into an integral in the mind, into what we rightfully call the imagination. And the imagination is a structuring, basic comportment of the symbolic mind to have a structure that has a clear connection with the referentiality of existence, of existentials, of existential action, of existential things, so that rituals and symbols then are tuned to each other in just this way. And what they tune is the space between them, which is the mythic dimension, the mythic phase, as I have phrased it. Because when one sees ritual and symbols as phases of a cycle, the intermediate interface between them is the phase of myth, which is the phase of experience, which is the phase of indexed by oral language, the telling, the hearing and the telling, where the language by speaking and the language by hearing participates in the actions and in the things and in the way in which they then generate feelings, so that feeling tones and imagery are related like peanut butter and jelly on the bread of the ritual existentiality and the symbols integral. And that gives us that complete cycle, the 4 seasons. But if we see the transform of the 4 seasons into 4 dimensions, 4 phases, one begins to understand that you need a fifth dimension like the sum to make the hand. And so the hand becomes a symbol of the release of freedom from the wheel of Dharma. And to see Dharma as a wheel is not totally a negative thing chained to the wheel, but one then can understand that the whole dynamic of the way in which the universe can work is by wheels, by arranging the wheels, so that one then can have chariots, one then can have wagons, one then can have gears, which leads to technology, which leads us to a break. Let's come back to the way in which vision and history, they work in the following way. Vision is a field, and history is within that field. Like nature and myth work together, nature is a field and myth is a flow within that field. Nature has an integral, serious integral, because the integral of nature is zero. Nevertheless, it is a field, not a 0 point. Let's be realistic. A 0 point vanishes. Comprende? Into what does it vanish? Zero field. So the encompassingness of zero is that it participates in an integral cycle. How does it participate? It participates by conferring what is called ordinality. There's cardinality, which is the counting, which is the sequencing, 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D. What you can count on, that's the way in which cardinality works. Ordinality is the stepping up by powers, beginning not with 1, but beginnings with 10. The 1 and the 0. So the 0 appears in the counting due to the ordinality being able to interface and enmesh with the cardinality, so that the 0 gives the powers to cardinality. You can count by tens, powers of 10. The most interesting is to count by powers of 2 by squares. And when you're dealing with space, squares, geometrically, mathematically, are extremely useful, and one of the great advances in world civilization, not culture, civilization. Culture deals with truth, with Dharma. Civilization appreciates high Dharma. In the way in which the high Dharma participates, the squares apply to the geometry of spatiality. The whole development of an appreciation, the triumph of a method of determining least squares, very famous in mathematical history. But one can also count by, that is indexed by threes, by cubes. Not only squares, but cubes. And cubes very often refer to the cubicality, not just the plane of space, like plane geometry, but the cube, and the cube has a deeper quality then, that it is all three dimensions of space. So that you can have ordinality by squares and ordinality by cubes. And they relate to each other in such a way that the progression of squares is able to ratio with the progression of cubes. And however large the squares and the cubes, if they're at the same horizon of ordinality, they will always make a ratio that resolves to 1. It's called Bode's Law, B-O-D-E. Bode's Law, in the way in which planets arrange themselves in the solar system, so that the squares of the space that the plane of the orbit describes and the cubes of the fact that the orbits are not circles but ellipses, that the time has to speed up on the curve of the ellipse and has to slow down on the elongation of the ellipse. And the first person to ever master the mathematics of putting the squares of space and the cubes of cubic space together to make ratios of the real was Kepler. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare. Shakespeare born in 1564, Kepler in 1571. He lived longer than Will. Shakespeare died at 52, 1616. Kepler lived on to 1634. It was Kepler's meticulous analysis of Tycho Brahe's observations of the movements of Mars against the starry expanse for years and years and years at his big sit-in-lay-in telescope observation place on the island of Uraniborg off the coast of Denmark, not all that far by boat from Copenhagen. The squares and the cubes, that space as a plane and cubic space then as a way of having a trigonometry come into play. Not just a geometry, but a trigonometry, because one is now dealing with a time element. And because there is always an integral that is the dharma, the truth of the way in which you're computing, the cardinality and the ordinality now become comprehensive. And when they are comprehensive, one understands that the dynamic of time comes into play with the ratio of the real, where the space and the cubic space, the plane and the cube, come together as an expressive unity that one then has a way of establishing. If one could have the dynamic of time woven into that, so that the plane geometric and the cubic trigonometric now give us a calculus, that now one has a third highest power. One has a way of calculating the infinitely small and the infinitely large together, all within the theoretical, the contemplative pairing, putting a parenthesis around 0, 1. That in between 0 and 1, there is an infinite increase, differential equations, and from 1 to 0, there's an infinite decrease, integral calculations, and one can now understand to any degree of specificity whatsoever due to Newton and Leibniz. One can understand that one is able to express in a grand Principia Mathematica that this is now a way to understand the universe in any degree of specificity one wants to attain. All you need to do is not just ask a question, but to phrase what it is that you're curious about investigating in that language. And the investigation carried out in that language is able to give you not just the result, not just the answer, but to give you the further resolution of this in terms of an integral, so that one understands that what you ask, here is what you get. But what you asked was incomplete, so what you got is also incomplete, which means then that you have to widen your theoria. You have to widen, and it's not that consciousness gains, it's that your access enlarges. Consciousness is an infinite field. And an artist can tell, not just immediately, but before immediate. Because an artist deals not only with the infinite field of differential consciousness, but the integral field of zero nature, so that what occurs to them doesn't occur instantly in time, but spontaneously. Out of before there was a time. The ancient Egyptians called that eternity. An artist's familiar realm is to refresh instantly and then spontaneously. Instantly, in this is the moment, aha, and spontaneously, I knew this before the aha was expressible, happened. And so the coursing in eternity is free. Not just true freedom, but high dharma freedom. When human organizations get to a certain complexity of commandeering, of the cardinalities, the ordinalities, the planes and the cubes, and factoring in the dynamics, that complexity comes to an immensity which one feels that if you can only ask the question. And that's one of the great poetic lines in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, preluded by the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The evening lies like a patient etherized on the table. I shall wear my socks rolled down. If only I could ask the question, which is never askable in those terms and leads directly to the wasteland. At the close of the 19th century, one of the most powerful, integral complexities in the world at that time, seemingly, was the Theosophical Society, formed around Madame Blavatsky, a Russian. She could roll her own cigarettes, she could go adventuring on her own, she could understand completely all kinds of complexities, and wrote a huge 3-volume series called, the volumes are called The Secret Doctrine of All Time. And complemented, because that was like the cube, complemented that with the square, 2 volumes, a pair, called Isis Unveiled. And between Isis Unveiled pair and Secret Doctrine cubed, now we have the path. Now we have the one. And all we need is that one messianic figure to commence the teaching of this. About a generation after Madame passed away, the Theosophical Society had gained in focus and in complexity, and made in 1911 the Order of the Star. We will have a star Messiah who will come and will deliver us. And so we will prepare. We will prepare all over the world for the coming of this Messiah, of the Order of the Star to present, because this is the way it should be. And they found, by a very sophisticated divination quality of investigation in India, a young, interesting, more than interesting, incredible young boy. And he was very close to his younger brother. That boy's name was Krishnamurti. And so they prepared him by education for years and years. Education overseen by a man named Leadbeater, C.W. Leadbeater, to be the Messiah for the Order of the Star. And when he came of full age and maturity in 1929, he had centers in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. He had centers in the Netherlands at Camp Omen, O-M-M-E-N, centers in India, in Madras state, near the southern edge of Madras, now a huge metropolis, where the Adyar River came in at Adyar, and many other places in the world. And on August 2nd, 1929, before thousands of people in the Netherlands at Camp Omen, he dissolved the Order of the Star. He said, there are no more messiahs. When Krishnamurti at 91 passed away in that distant suburb of Los Angeles called Ojai, a bulletin was put out by the Krishnamurti Foundation. Their bulletin had been the magazine that began in the 1920s to be the vehicle by which the world would be able to keep track of the Theosophical Society, the Order of the Star, Krishnamurti, and the special issue was put out, and a photograph of Krishnamurti was placed before the first page describing the event and the events, And then they reprinted his presentation in 1929 of dissolving the order of the star and why there were no more messiahs. There were no more orders of the star. There were no more Theosophical Societies. He died in 1986. The secretary, the last secretary to Madame Blavatsky was George Robert Stowe Mead, M-E-A-D, G.R.S. Mead. And G.R.S. Mead was a genius, not like Krishnamurti in the sense of being able to spontaneously speak high dharma for not only as long as one cared to speak and listen, but for years into decades, and he taught for almost 70 years worldwide in just his own way of sitting on a wooden kitchen chair and just speaking, not the stage setting that this speaker employs, because this teacher is the art of learning and not the learnless spontaneity of realization. We have to learn first. Then we don't have to do much except to be able to understand that it's important to keep the history fresh and alive in the arts and the sciences. Because along with the arts, like the arts mitigate the interface between vision and history, science does the same between it's a way in which there is the complementarity that science brings into play with history. Art brings vision and history together. Science brings history and complementarity together. The complementarity comes because one has to save the natural cycle. There was a great high dharma critical writer named Owen Barfield, and one of his first wonderful little books is called Saving the Appearances. It's important to save the appearances. Yes, they are appearances, but the appearance of the appearances is a wonderful present that one learns to open again and again. And the opening again and again is a way of transforming any calibration, however complex or simple, into a recalibration where you save the appearance and can still appreciate and use the calibration, but now the recalibrations are infinite. But one has to do this in a particular releasing way. That is, one has to do a doubling, and then one has to do a tripling, and then one has to let it be free. So there is such a thing that is pithy, and that is the triads, the cubes, lead to a use of the squares, of the geometry, which leads to not just the development of the path, which is a path integral, but leads to the field which is a field of zero and infinity. There is a path integral, and its appearances are magnificent. But they do not just lead indefinitely. They lead to whatever it is that you are going to from wherever it was that you were beginning from. And to go before the beginning and beyond the end, one enters into the eternal. And to not know that means that you make a false image and turn it into a phony idea of eternity. And that's how devolution happens, and the beauty of the world becomes demonic eventually. We live in 2014 where the world is not just crazy, certifiably, but does not know it is ignorant, which is worse than being crazy. G.R.S. Mead, being the secretary of Madame Blavatsky when she passed away, had a chance to be the titular head of the Theosophical Society. He's the one that took over. Madame Blavatsky's magazine was called Lucifer. One would think, yes, well, Lucifer is demonic, right? The devil. And she thought, no. This Lucifer is the light giver, the light bringer. My magazine, Lucifer, is the light bringer. Mead understood that this was a limitation of the imagery, of the symbol. And so he changed Lucifer to have a different title, and the magazine became Quest. And under Mead, the magazine Quest became one of the real great vehicles for a transform that was happening in the world from 1892, when Madame passed away, into the beginnings of the 20th century. And by 1911, when the Order of the Star was being formed, Mead already had seen the limitations of the Theosophical Society so limited that he left society. He dissolved himself out of it, and a couple of hundred people who were like the cream of those conscious in the society went with him. And they formed a kind of equality of that would be recognizable in high Dharma of noble friends, a phrase from Zarathustra of about 4,000 years ago. Pursuant to this, G.R.S. Mead began to put out book after book, volume after volume of very high Dharma concerns. One of the ways in which he had weaned himself away from the Theosophical Society's limitations, phony grandness, and not all of it seems phony at once, or is phony at all, but that in aggregate, it aggregates only into a monumentality that, as E.E. Cummings in one of his poems said, it comes out like a ribbon and lies flat on the brush. One of his great magnum opuses is a 3-volume translation of Thrice Greatest Hermes. Volume 2, in the middle of the 3, are the classic Hermetica, and then a volume that leads us to them, and then a 3rd volume that leads us with them even further. And this was all published in London by Watkins, a very famous publisher still in business, in 1906. By that time, G.R.S. Mead had understood enough to understand that the Hermetica were the creme de la creme of a whole Hellenistic era that was not reducible to what academics had called, they were just imitators, they were syncretists, they were piecing together patchwork by patchwork. Even so, one can say there's a great art to making beautiful heirloom quilts out of seeming patchwork. There's all sorts of ways of understanding that the interfacing in what is called the Hellenistic era is an interfacing that happens just before a carrier wave transforming the time form of civilization, and the next century or two that carried the beyond of the carrier wave, but was being sabotaged all the time, every time, by those that would undercut it. Instead of being an undertone, it's like an undercurrent. And that if you try to swim ashore with an undertow, you will drown, because the undertone will convert your swimming towards the shore into swimming parallel to the shore in place. And so the enemy of civilization are not the enemies. It's those who themselves constitute the undertow. To not recognize even the possibility that when a time form is over, it's over, and a new time form has spontaneously been born. The whole quality of that in ancient Egypt, 3,000 years before the Hermetica, written in Alexandria about in the 90s AD, the pair of figures that were tunable 3,000 years before were Isis and Osiris. Here's a little study recently done, and a man named Tom Hare, H-A-R-E, remembering Osiris. It's not only the remembering of Osiris, but it's literally putting the members of Osiris back together, remembering him, and then remembering him. And it's interesting because the gerund, remembering, is not memory. Memory is a function area of the mind, much like the imagination. They go together, in fact. The memory and the imagination are buddies. More than that, they are kind of like found siblings that belong together, because the imagination, when its function of imaging becomes not just imaging, but becomes imagining, the transcendental imagining goes creative. It's free. It's free to play. It's free to play in the eternal, which is where the springs of art come into play. And so art is creative imagining and remembering together. But in order to do an exchange, a reciprocality which is universal, as the imagination gifts its imagining creatively now in the freedom of vision, vision takes remembering and gifts in the place of the imagining that has been given, gifts back the memory. And so remembering becomes the memory in mind, and the imagination in mind becomes creative imagining and vision. So that vision and the mind, one an integral and one a differential, have this paired double tie. They have a tie between the imagination and creative imagining, and remembering and the memory. So that it isn't that the whole cycle, the integral of nature is cut off, it's that it's transformed. It's given a thumb, an identity, not an identification by that thumbprint, but given the activity of transformation as a dimension. And once one understands that, it isn't just remembering Osiris, but that Osiris now can be embodied. Here's a study, Embodying Osiris, The Secrets of Alchemical Transformation, with the Eye of Horus. Because Isis becomes fertile and pregnant by the remembered Osiris. Every part of 14 parts of Osiris that were cut up by his demonic nemesis Set, the red dog, jealous, desert, demonic, cut him up into 14 pieces, and 13 pieces were found by Isis. She went around and gathered up to remember him. But she could not find the penis, because the penis had not remained. It had been swallowed by a blind fish in the Nile. And that fish was unable to see, but navigated by a kind of a sonar reverberation. And so the disappearance of the phallus of Osiris was replenished by Isis in a kind of a supranatural way, and by that supranatural phallus she became pregnant, and their son was Horus. Their son was the eye of high Dharma, able to see the truth that we are not limited in birthing, but we are capable of rebirthing. More next week.